Perfect. All right. Thank you for coming today. My name is Sarah Coney. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Manager for the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, or CRIS. Today we have Jennifer Riddle with Don't Let It Loose as the next part of our Pets as Pests webinar series. Don't Let It Loose was founded in 2012 and is dedicated to reducing instances of pet release and the introduction of invasive species through the pet industry. For years, the Invasive Species Action Network, or ISAN, has played a key role in managing the Don't Let It Loose program, partnering with state agencies, independent pet stores, industry leaders, educators, and manufacturing partners to promote responsible pet ownership and pet rehoming when necessary. Jen's involvement with Don't Let It Loose began in 2021, but it wasn't until a year later that she joined ISAN full-time as their programs manager. In her time at ISAN, she has worked to educate pet owners and recreationists on ways they can help prevent the spread of invasive species through simple actions. Outside the office, she's often with her own pets hiking and paddling through the Rocky Mountains, which sounds like a fantastic use of time. Turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah said, my name is Jennifer Riddle. I'm the programs manager for Invasive Species Action Network, or ISAN. We're a nonprofit based out of Livingston, Montana, and we dedicate a lot of our work to reducing the human-caused spread of invasive species. One of the ways that we do that is through this Don't Let It Loose program. So I'll share a little bit about the program later in the presentation, but first I'm going to give a little bit of context for the pet industry as a whole and how that feeds into sometimes serving as a pathway for invasive species introductions. And I'll try to advance. Let me know if you can see my next slide. Can you see that, Sarah?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'd guess that probably a lot of us have seen headlines or maybe heard some anecdotal evidence of pets either being intentionally released into the wild or shockingly unintentionally escaping enclosures sometimes and causing disturbances and creating these sensational headlines across the country. So I'll talk a little bit about occurrences of pets that have been released and then really what ISAN has been doing over the last over a decade through the Don't Let It Loose program to help to educate pet owners and helping them really to just be making responsible decisions when it comes to buying a pet, purchasing a pet, the right type of pet for them, and then what to do in the event of being unable to care for a pet anymore. So to give you guys some background and context in case you're unfamiliar, the global pet industry is huge and has been growing pretty significantly, steadily since at least 2008. So it's valued at about $259 billion globally. Over half of that, $147 billion, is courtesy of the US pet industry. The American Pet Products Association does an analysis each year to try to better understand pet ownership and pet spending trends in the US. So that 2024 report came out back in April. And while a lot of the findings were to be expected, if you're somebody that's been looking at these reports every year like me, it is shocking still in that this is such a large industry and still really needs to be on our radar as a potentially really important pathway for invasive species introduction. So like I said, it's been growing pretty steadily since around 2009. But there has been we saw a sharp increase in pet ownership between 2020 and 2023, which is largely attributed to the COVID pandemic. And we're still seeing pet ownership in general and number of households with pets rising, with somewhere around 70% of US households reportedly having some type of pet in the household. That's, tens of millions of animals that are being bought, sold, and traded each year. And 33 million households reportedly have some type of non-traditional pet. So we're not talking about cats and dogs. We're talking about fresh and saltwater fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds would be kind of in that non-traditional category. So it's a huge industry. we're seeing it continue to grow. That's kind of the background here. It's expected to continue to grow up to like $5 billion globally by 2030. So we're not really seeing any slowing down anytime soon. Another interesting piece of context, I think, so we've known for a while that the pet trade, the global pet trade, is a prominent way that invasive species are being moved around. This study, though, I found it really interesting. If you have some time, I would recommend, honestly, following that QR code and giving it a read. This was really, came out in 2021. It was really trying to identify the prevalence of invasive species within the pet trade, and if there was any favorability to invasive species in that industry. And they found that there is actually oftentimes an overrepresentation of invasive species among small mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish in the global pet trade. And also, oftentimes, invasive species are seeing higher commercial success. So they are more profitable and they're easier to sell invasive species than non-invasive species. So just another interesting piece of information to be having in the back of our minds when we're talking about how important this pathway could be. So the issue is really that additionally, we know, unfortunately, that pet owners, when faced with really tough decisions of, I can no longer care for my pet for any number of reasons, either I'm relocating to take it with me, I didn't know how much this pet was going to cost me, I didn't know how stinky it was going to be, whatever the reason is, we know that sometimes pet owners are no longer able to care for their pets and may decide to release them. So in the global pet trade, is associated with at least thousands of species invasions to date. And we're going to expect to see an increase in that pathway again over the next few years as we're seeing the continuous trends of pet ownership increasing, especially in the US. It's easier and easier to access pet ownership in general, right? The barrier to entry is pretty low for a lot of species. The number of species that are available is continuing to grow. It seems every day you can get kind of whatever you want on the internet. And then also the ability for some of these species to establish in an introduced location, that habitat suitability, we're seeing shifts, and we can expect to continue to see shifts as we see these symptoms of climate change. So, of course, one unfortunate reality of a pet being released into the environment is that it may not be able to survive, right? But maybe even a more unfortunate reality is that it could be able to survive and become an invasive species and really start to establish and take over in a native and a wild place. So if a pet species is able to establish in an introduced location, we're of course going to be seeing some over and out competing with native species for food and habitat resources. Something that a lot of people don't maybe necessarily attribute to pet releases too, but if a pet release results in a real establishment of a species that needs to be eradicated or removed, then we may be taking away from any existing monetary resources that have already been going into existing invasive species removal and eradication efforts in an area. Also, reptiles and amphibians are pretty famous for having all kinds of diseases. And so when they're released into the wild, those diseases could be spreading to our native wildlife, could impact them. There's also some, impacts and implications there on human health. And then, of course, this, hybridization to invasive species that have been introduced through the pet trade have been known to hybridize with native populations, which is going to be decreasing the biodiversity in a given area. So there's kind of this wide range of impacts that we could be seeing from the pet industry and released pets possibly being introduced. So with the Don't Let It Loose program, we first kind of have identified this trend that we see, right? So there's a new pet owner or even a prospective pet owner. And then down the line, either, unforeseen circumstances, right? Like I have to move, I have to downsize, relocate, I can't take care of this pet anymore, may come into play. Or on the front end, right? I didn't properly prepare maybe necessarily to have this type of pet. I didn't know how long it was going to live. I didn't know how much I was going to be spending on food and the enclosure each year, I didn't realize that my electric bill was going to go up drastically every month by getting this reptile. So there's all kinds of reasons that could lead somebody to being no longer able to care for their pet. But whenever they are, we really want to be directing people to rehoming their pet. And there's lots of ways that people can rehome their pets that we'll get into, maybe contacting shelters, pet stores. There's tons of Facebook groups for, local communities to rehome within the neighborhood. But we really don't want people to be doing, of course, is releasing. And in the Don't Let It Loose program campaign, we really try to target this audience and new pet ownership and prospective pet ownership, to really get ahead of the problem as much as we possibly can, right? We don't want to wait necessarily until somebody can no longer care for their pet. So there's lots of ways that we have kind of tried to tackle this issue over the years. We have, worked with manufacturing partners. So these are folks that are selling maybe live animals or habitats, feeder insects, anything like that online or in stores, that kind of have a large customer base. We've begun reaching out with them and working with them, and really any way that they'll have us. We have a lot of flexibility within the program to be able to kind of adapt the message to all kinds of different business models. And so some of the ways that we've done that is working on, ad campaigns, social media partnerships, adding information to their website. So their customers that are coming online to make a purchase are presented with that information. We've also partnered up with some of our manufacturing partners at pet trade expos, reptile expos, those kinds of things. So that's been a pretty cool, interesting part of the program to see how those folks are interested in partnering with us. We've also done targeted advertising, and I'll show you some examples of what those ads have looked like. We've run those ads nationally. I guess maybe I didn't mention, but this program really has a national reach. So we're based in Montana, and we do have a lot of support in Montana. But when it comes to advertising and some of our outreach and stuff, we will travel and really try to get this message out nationally. So we'll do, targeted advertising. If you're searching for something like where to get a heating lamp for your bearded dragon, or if you're searching for fish flakes or whatever type of pet product you might be searching for, you may be presented for this to this advertisement that would then draw you to our website to give you some of those resources and information on invasive species. We've also done high-risk water body signage, and so that has really been with the help of state agencies to help us identify what those high-risk water bodies might be. Those are often going to be urban and suburban, ponds, lakes, anything that's really accessible that may be highly susceptible to pet release. We're not like backpacking in our aquarium to dump it necessarily, or maybe bodies of water in parks that have already seen some pet release may be good candidates for these high-risk water body signs too. And I'll show you some examples of those as well. And then maybe my favorite aspect of the program that I think has been really successful is this pet store partnership. So we recognize that we can't just ask somebody not to do something, right? We have to be able to offer some type of alternative behavior if we want folks to not release their pets, right? Well, what else can I do? So we've been working since 2012 to build this pet rehoming network across at least the Western US. We're a small team, so it takes a while to get out east. So we don't have a full rehoming network in New York. But for example, if you had a box turtle and you lived in Montana or Wyoming or Colorado, you could go onto our website, click on the map for your state, and you'd be presented with a list of pet stores and animal rescues all across the state that may be able to help you in rehoming your pet. And I think that those relationships are really such a fundamental part of the Don't Let It Loose program, because we really rely on those partners who are directly in the faces of pet owners way more often than I am to help us, one, be, properly educating everyone before they purchase a pet, what to expect on the care for that pet. And then, directing them to the website to give them more information about the risks of releasing unwanted pets, and also to find alternative solutions, right? So some examples of some of our outreach tools to consumers. We have in the middle here, I went to a reptile expo in Oregon last year with one of our industry partners, Josh's Frogs. And I would really like to see a lot more of this happening, maybe some state presence or local, nonprofit presence. It's just such a good place, I found, and I've been to a couple more since, to really get in front of pet owners and prospective pet owners, and talk to them about this stuff. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to a reptile expo or large pet trade event like this, but in my experience, it seems that there's a lot of impulse buying of pets there, and sometimes even a lack of information about proper care of these animals and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of room for improvement and outreach at these types of events. And it's been really great and helpful to have our industry partners on board with us for that. Then we have this fish bag here that has the Don't Let It Loose logo and also the Ripple logo. So we also recognize that there are a few other state or local programs or outreach messaging campaigns that are all kind of trying to accomplish the same thing, right? So for example, in Michigan, they run this Ripple program through the MSU extension for reducing invasive pet and plant escapes. So we try to work really closely with Ripple and their employees to share their local information, right? They know way more about invasive species concerns and risks in Michigan than I do. So helping them to elevate that messaging there, and then even working with them to co-brand some things, right? These messages are really trying to accomplish similar objectives, and really complement each other really well. These fish bags are something that we often give out to our pet store partners. We don't pay anybody to be a rehoming partner or a Don't Let It Loose ambassador, but we do have a couple incentive items. So one of them is these fish bags. And then we'll also give them, some stickers, bookmarks, little posters, anything to give out to their customers. And they typically like those little incentive items. And then all the way on the right here, we have this bright blue sign. That's one of those high-risk water body signs. This one's up in Montana. We have them up in, I want to say 8 states so far. So probably like 800 signs or so that are out there distributed at these high-risk locations. We customize them for each state as well. So they're not all going to say, Montana, protect our waters, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. But we'll put the appropriate reporting agency, the appropriate rules and regulations. It may not necessarily be illegal to dump aquarium pets in every state. So we try to make sure that information is accurate too. But that's an example of what one of these metal high-risk water body signs looks like. So some of our other outreach tools, these are the ad campaigns that I mentioned. This is the most recent ad campaign. We ran this last year, mostly targeting, aquatic pet ownership. And again, if you're searching for how to feed your frog or turtle or fish, or looking for a new enclosure or bedding or anything like that, that's going to make you a good candidate for getting this information, because you, one, may already have a pet that at some point you may need to rehome, or two, you may be a diligent prospective pet owner who's doing some research. And so we would want to get this in front of you as quick as possible. And it's just been a really good way to drive folks to our website, and help connect them with local invasive species information where we can, and some rehoming resources if we need to. Another outreach tool that I haven't touched on yet, because it's still sort of in the works. We've been developing this classroom educator toolkit to try to get this message to a younger audience, especially in classrooms that may have a classroom pet. This seems really like an easy way to talk about not releasing pets and being responsible pet owners with kids. We have a really fun activity that we like to do with kids. We've tested this out at like Arbor Day and outdoor classroom events and things like that. But we really wanted to try to get this into classrooms. We developed this in 2020 and 2021. And then it became really hard to actually get into classrooms because of COVID. And we haven't quite found our way back there yet, but we have made all of these resources available online and done a couple small classroom events where we can and where we've been invited. We have a suite of educational videos too for younger audiences. If you're interested in any of that, that QR code should take you to where they are on our website, along with where you can find downloadable the whole educator toolkit, right? So the game, the bookmarks, there's a responsible pet ownership pledge that's really fun to do with kids. So there's a lot of potential still there, and we're hoping to continue exploring that. So of course, in the years that ISAN has been managing Don't Let It Loose, we have identified some gaps, and there are some challenges to this pathway too. It is such a diverse pathway too, right? We're not just talking about people that own pythons. We're not just talking about people that own goldfish. There are all kinds of different pet owners out there. And so sometimes it can be challenging to find the correct messaging that covers all of these different types of pet owners, right? So one gap I would say is a more detailed pet ownership census. So I mentioned that analysis that's done every year by the American Pet Products Association. And that gives us a lot of good information. And they really kind of have the monopoly on that type of analysis. I don't know of other folks that are really trying to understand or categorize pet ownership locally or on the state level. But I think that that kind of data would be really useful in targeting this messaging. So if we knew what type of non-traditional pets were most popular in Montana or in New York, we may be able to tailor some messaging for those audiences. And I think that could be a really valuable tool. We've also noticed a bit of a challenge accessing prohibited species regulation information. And prohibited species, known invasive species, as I mentioned, we know that they're being purchased and brought into states where they are prohibited or illegal to have, because you can buy just about anything online. And so, something we've thought that may be helpful in addressing this is if folks have access to the list of prohibited species that are in their state, right? But whenever we try to find that information, oftentimes we find that it's either very difficult to locate online or it's covered in legalese and just pretty hard to digest, especially as just a pet owner. So we're working on trying to compile all of this data and digest it a little bit, and maybe be able to provide an easier route to prohibited species regulation information for each state through the Don't Let It Loose website. Another, piece of information that would be really useful to have that we haven't seen a lot of research on is, better understanding the drivers of pet release versus rehoming. Why do people really make this decision? Is it truly just a lack of, information of, understanding the risks of invasive species? Is it something else? Is it a distrust of pet stores in the area? Who knows? There are all kinds of things that could be drivers to this decision. And it would be really useful to be able to study that a little bit more, but we don't currently have a really extensive understanding necessarily of the drivers there. So in the future, I talked about trying to get into classrooms a little bit more. That's something we'd really like to see. It's always a ton of fun when we get to do that. Kids have lots of questions about the pets that they have at home. And that's a good way to get that information to parents too, right? We also want to work closely with zoos and aquariums. We've started to do this a little bit. We've begun a partnership with Zoo Montana, which is the zoo here in Billings, Montana. And they have reported to us that they see a lot of pet surrenders happening at their location. So they will have people calling. They said sometimes 10 people a week calling about rehoming a pet, which, it seems like a lot of people calling to rehome a pet every week. They've had people just drop off pets at their front door. And so it seems like a good place to be getting out information at zoos and aquariums. So we're going to continue to try to work with those groups. getting into the classroom, expanding our state resources. So this map on the left here is all of the states where we have some amount of invasive species resources available. We at least have contact with an invasive species manager in that state, and are starting to build out an outreach campaign in that area at least. So a lot of the Western states, we have a kind of full approach, right? We've been out, we've visited with the independent pet stores in the location. We have a full-fledged rehoming network. We've done high-risk water body signage. We've done press releases and ad campaigns, and really trying to saturate the message in a lot of those Western states. And then towards the eastern part of the country, we've begun reaching out to folks to at least be able to offer maybe some of that prohibited species information, but also just general what invasive species are most concerning in New York or in North Carolina or in Georgia, trying to at least start to build a resources page for those locations until we can get out there and really start to saturate the don't let it loose message a little bit more. We really want to spend some more time going to these pet expos. Like I said, we've done a handful of them now, and each time they seem to be really effective, right? We have a ton of good conversations with folks who are getting pets for the first time that day. We also have taken it upon ourselves sometimes to compile animal care sheets because we've noticed a lack of that information at some of these pet expos. So if you're walking home with something today, here's a website where you can get all of this, animal care information, so you know exactly what you need to get and do to take care of it properly. So we really want to continue to have a presence at these pet expos as much as we possibly can. And then, of course, we want to continue to grow our industry partnerships too. That could look like, continuing to be invited to pet expos. That could be, getting more information on their website, or, if somebody is purchasing a live animal on their website, maybe they get a particular message or something included in their shipment. So we want to continue to see how these industry partners are willing to work with us. And then increasing the accessibility to our messaging too. So creating multilingual materials, I think, is a really great first step. And then also we're going to be hosting a couple pet rehoming events too in Montana. So we have two planned. This will be our first time hosting an event like this, but we're going to host one in Billings and one in Missoula in the next year. So we're excited to see how that looks. And it may give us some good information too about that, categorizing pet ownership information, at least for Montana. So we can continue to tweak that messaging to get it where it needs to be. So that's kind of the overview of the program. I'm happy to answer any questions. Here's my contact information too. So if you think of something later and you want to get in touch with me, jot it down. And then also, I guess I'll say, we do have, maybe you saw New York highlighted on that map. We have some very beginning stages, basic invasive species information that we've been able to collect, working with Catherine, potentially, from the Department of Environmental Quality. But if anybody else has additional information to contribute to that website, or wants to talk at all about expanding don't let it loose messaging in your area, I'd really love to chat about that. So let me know.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves or put it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'd be happy to answer them. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you again. Here in New York, I think most of our pet releases tend to be more aquatic related. That's unfortunately what I deal with a lot. We see a lot of goldfish, koi. Our watershed, our watercraft inspection stewards have stopped people from trying to dump goldfish into the Delaware. So we do see that a lot. Aquarium plants are a huge issue. Hydrilla, Carolina fanwort, a whole bunch of aquatic plants that have become highly invasive here in New York were first introduced either through the aquarium trade, water gardening. We're lucky that we're not as hospitable as maybe Florida for a lot of reptiles and amphibians. But in particular, the red-eared slider comes to mind, which is native over to the Mississippi, but has been introduced throughout a lot of New York and competes in particular with our native painted turtles. So there's just here in New York, there's plenty of challenges with invasive species that have released as pets. I personally have 3 aquariums, which is down from my all-time of 7.
It's a
So I
lot.
am I am very heavily invested in the aquarium trade in particular.
Mhm. Yeah, we have similar challenges with red-eared sliders, competing with our painted turtles. So yeah, we see a lot of that here too. We're getting a lot of goldfish being released. I think there's a lot of overlap because there are certain, types of pets that are more popular than others, right? So those are the ones that are going to be more likely to be released. But you brought up a really good point too about aquarium plants. This isn't really just somebody scooping out their goldfish and dumping it into the lake down the street. They're dumping the entire contents of their aquarium too. So any plants, anything that could be in that water is being released too. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I don't see any questions. But again, if you do think of anything down the line, Jennifer's contact info is right there. Please feel free to reach out to Chris. But yeah, thank you everybody for attending the seminar or for attending the webinar. We will follow up with this on August 8th. The American Bird Conservancy will be talking about cats and their negative ecological effects on our native ecosystems. So please stay tuned. And if you missed the last webinar, that's also up on the CRISP website and up on our YouTube. So thank you. Of
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah.
course. So I'm going to stop the recording.